As one of the foremost brain surgeons in the UK, Henry Marsh provided a startlingly detailed and honest account of his profession in his first best-selling memoir, Do No Harm. He illuminated the incredible level of responsibility that he had for his patients in a field where the slightest of mistakes by the surgeon can have catastrophic consequences.
Now, in a second book called Admissions, he reveals why he quit the NHS, the challenges of surgery in Nepal and Ukraine, and how his work has shaped his own thoughts about ageing and mortality. Henry, welcome to
Hi, Henry.
Five Live.
Hello, hi.
Thank you for joining us. Why did you decide to go to Nepal after retiring from the NHS?
Because having retired from the NHS, having slightly thrown my toys out of my pram, I suddenly realised I really wasn't ready to stop working. And the senior and originally the first neurosurgeon in Nepal, he and I were trainees together 35 years ago. So I emailed him and said, would you like me to come and work with you for a while? And he said, yes, sure.
This is Dev.
This is Dev, yes.
Yeah, Upendra Devkota.
Yes, Professor Upendra Devkota, yes.
So he didn't need to lure you or twist your
No,
arm
no,
as
not
such.
at all.
Yeah.
No. I think I didn't have to twist his arm particularly either.
No.
But, I mean, as I've said elsewhere, surgery is an addiction and it's quite hard to stop.
What is it about surgery
It's incredibly
that is so addictive?
It's incredibly exciting, and you live very intensely for the present, and even you're never bored when operating. Most of the operating I do is very serious and major, but occasionally I do fairly minor operations on peripheral nerves, and even that, it is never boring. And I think most surgeons would say the same. I mean, in corny terms, you talk about an adrenaline rush. But it's very exciting. It's dangerous. If it wasn't dangerous, it wouldn't be exciting. But it's your intense concern the patient should do well that makes it exciting. If you didn't actually care about your patients, operating wouldn't be very interesting.
There is also, though, presumably, an extraordinary rush to the head of power at some points, given that you are almost in charge of life and death.
Oh, very much so. It can be deeply corrupting, and I've worked in many countries. I have seen examples of surgeons becoming corrupted by the power they hold over their patients. I mean, just recently, this ghastly case with this surgeon up north, Patterson. I mean, that's an example of the corruption of power. He probably had, maybe, I don't know the details, he may well have had some kind of personality defect in the first place. But it's very difficult how to get around this problem. Patients are not consumers. They're deeply vulnerable. And yet if you try to regulate and invigilate everything doctors do, it's not practical. And the whole system completely gums up.
Although you have said that there isn't maybe the same level of machismo in neurosurgery as there is in, say, heart surgery.
I think that's true. I mean, I know I know exceptions to that. I know a few neurosurgeons, not in this country, who suffer from serious machismo. But on the whole, most neurosurgeons, although I think all neurosurgeons have to find risk attractive, if you didn't like frightening yourself, you wouldn't do it. But on the whole, neurosurgeons, I think, because what we do is so dangerous, we all have to live with bad results, and we all have sort of guilty secrets. And I think it doesn't easily lead to machismo unless you're very blind to bad results.
Can I ask you what it's like to operate in Nepal when you don't have at your fingertips the same type of resources that the NHS?
Well, in fact, well...
Or perhaps I'm making an assumption that you don't.
Well, in terms of the actual technical equipment, of the actual operating, both in Nepal and now in Ukraine, when I started working in Ukraine 25 years ago, then the equipment was very primitive. The problems more are the post-operative care and intensive care, nursing, things like that. That's which is certainly not as good as what I'm used to. And that's quite worrying and difficult.
And of course, a desperately poor country made more so by the earthquake.
Yes, no, Nepal is one of the poorest countries in the world, and in some ways neurosurgery is a bit of a luxury, because in fact neurosurgical illnesses are pretty rare, other than head injuries. And of course head injuries are now one of the commonest causes of deaths in young people in the world, and particularly in low-income countries where everybody drives motorbikes.
Yeah.
I mention in my book how Dev, who for a while was the Minister of Health under the last king in Nepal, said he's quite certain he's saved more lives by making crash helmets compulsory for motorcyclists than he'll ever save as a surgeon. But being Nepal, it's all terribly inconsistent. So for drivers wear helmets, but the pillion drivers don't. And there are lots of pillion. You'll often see 4 people on a motorbike.
Yeah, easily.
But only the drivers wearing a helmet.
Yeah, you often see it. I go to Sri Lanka regularly, and you'll see a father riding the motorbike, a mother on the back,
squeezed
and the
between.
2
Yes.
children squeezed between.
Thailand, the
It
absolute
looks
same.
funny until you see them come into hospital having come off.
Quite right. And you've described in Do No Harm and again in Admissions just about the way that quite a lot of the time brain surgery doesn't work.
There's a very high failure rate. I mean, I was working in Ukraine for the last 2 weeks, and I was doing paediatric work, which was my original specialty. And I saw 3 children with totally inoperable tumours, a particularly horrible, rare, fortunately, brain tumour called a diffuse intrapontine glioma. And it's heartbreaking, and the parents are desperate. And what's horrifying is that all the parents, because they desperately think they can get better treatment elsewhere, and they'd had offers of surgery, which is completely wrong, for large sums of money from various different countries. One of the problems with, I mean, people think I'm against the NHS because I like making fun of its problems, but I'm a passionate believer in socialised healthcare, because the more I see of commercial private healthcare systems, particularly in poor countries, the more I see it corrupting doctors and hospitals and patients exploited. It is really quite sickening at times.
Is it as important to say the right thing to a family as it is to do an operation, in terms of actually being brave enough to say to them, well, this child would be better off not having this operation?
Well, that's exactly what I was. I mean, my Ukrainian colleague said, please, as a as a Western doctor, please come and tell the parents there is no hope. And that's incredibly difficult. And then I was looking at the brain scan again and thinking, is this absolutely definitely the right diagnosis? I knew it was, but I was really worried, I might be wrong, I'm sentencing this child to death. But I had to look the parents in the eye and say, look, I've just been to a conference in America on paediatric neurosurgery. We discussed this particular sort of tumour. I'm afraid your child is going to die. And it's very, very difficult to say that. And they still won't accept it. I mean, parental love can blind people completely. It's not conditional. It can be overwhelming.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, all parents listening will be thinking that themselves.
And then you
thinking,
end
how
up
far would we go?
now.
And then you end up in this ironical situation that love becomes terribly selfish.
Well, yeah.
The child suffers because the parents can't accept the truth.
You have been through this yourself,
I've been through it with
and
my
it is the
son,
reason
yes.
that you
Yeah.
ended up doing neurosurgery. What happened?
More or less. There were other reasons as well. My son, when he was only 3 months old, had a brain tumour, but fortunately it was benign. And the surgeon, Norman Grant, who removed it, did a wonderful job. Again, coincidentally, really, I ended up being trained by Norman Grant many years later. And as of all these things, one is so grateful to doctors if they save your life or they save your child's life. I mean, Norman Grant certainly was the most modest of people. But you can see how it can turn surgeons' heads, things. And we all, when we're anxious as patients, we obviously invest our doctors and surgeons with superhuman abilities. We don't want to think they're fallible human beings. And then if the operation goes well, we sort of worship at the altar in outpatients afterwards. And some doctors get corrupted by that.
Professor Marsh, considering, as you've said, there are more losses than wins in the world of neurosurgery.
Well, I don't know if there are more, but there are many.
There are many,
There are
right.
more, I think, compared to many other surgical specialties.
Well, taking that into account, how then emotionally does a surgeon prepare to tell those parents, and then after, and then the surgeon in question is in the midst of all that grief and pain? How do they manage to then leave that at the door, as it were?
One of the difficulties, you don't see these conversations go on in private, not necessarily behind closed doors, but behind ridiculous curtains in NHS bays, because there's so often a lack of proper interview rooms. I mean, 35, 40 years ago when I was training, I would, as a registrar and senior registrar, I'd see my bosses sometimes talking, breaking bad news, as we call it, to patients and their families. But once you become a seen a doctor yourself, you don't see other people doing it. And one of the great difficulties, which I think many patients don't realise and many doctors don't realise, is it's very difficult to learn how to talk to patients in these circumstances because you never get any feedback. If I had to tell somebody they had cancer in the brain, they don't ring me up next day and say, Mr. Marsh, you were great, Mr. Marsh, you were crap. So it's very difficult to learn. And the whole basis of doing better with anything, is, you do it, you get feedback, you correct things, you do a bit better next time. If my books are any good, it's because I got lots of fantastic criticism, first of all, from my wife and then my editor and my literary agent.
And also because you kept a diary.
It's all that. But when you're talking to patients, you don't get this criticism. And it's why, and also bad news travels faster than good news. So you tend to hear more about doctors being incompetent at talking rather than we all assume our default position is all doctors ought to be good at doing it. But it's actually very difficult.
Have you developed emotional intelligence in that respect, or do you think it was something that you were naturally blessed with?
I don't know. I think I've got better with age. I think my son's illness was an invaluable experience to be at the receiving end right at the beginning of my surgical career. But I don't know what sort of doctor I would have been if I hadn't had that experience. But I think as you get older, your members of your family fall ill, friends do, and you start to see things a little bit from the other side. And then I've been a patient myself. There was nothing terribly serious. Well, it was potentially. It was retinal detachment. And it's so common you hear from older doctors like myself saying, it wasn't until I became a patient myself that I really understood what my patients were going through.
Well, it'd be interesting to know as well if it has changed your view or the NHS in any way, because you said earlier, that in your own words, that you threw your toys out of the pram because you were nearing retirement age, but decided to leave at a spur of the moment following a meeting with your medical director.
Well,
Is that
that's
fair to
right.
say?
Well, retirement, there used to be an official retirement age at 65, which in fact no longer applies. And I'd always assumed I'd probably go on longer because I liked the work so much. Although I was getting a bit bored because I didn't have enough operating to do because they'd increased when I was younger, I was operating 4 days a week. And then that dropped to 2 days a week because they'd increased the number of surgeons. And in fact, many neurosurgeons now only operate 1 day a week in the NHS, which of course is crazy. What are these highly trained people doing the rest of the week? God alone knows. So it's all very complicated. But I had a sort of temper tantrum with the medical director.
Why?
Oh, because we were being heavily criticised for wearing ties and wristwatches and traditional suits when we were all supposed to be bare from the elbows. And
There was a missive sent round, wasn't there?
Well,
a lengthy document.
That's right. But what annoyed me, it was coming from the NHS on high, and personally, I think it's all a sort of class warfare, but doctors should be no different from anybody else. Although it's the doctors who carry the can, believe you me, when anything goes wrong. But it was the fact, rather than this medical director saying, well, look, can you help us? Maybe it's all a bit silly, but this is government policy. No, we were just threatened with disciplinary action as though we were naughty schoolboys. And I thought, that's it. I'm not going to work in a place where I have all this life and death responsibility, and yet I'm treated like a naughty schoolboy. And that was it as far as I was concerned.
Do you regret it?
No, not at all. I still work part-time I go into my hospital still from sort of flexibly, in theory, 1 day a week, mainly to teach, occasionally to operate, and I love it. And I'm terribly glad, looking at my colleagues, I've got out of all the sort of hassle and demoralisation going on in the NHS. My view of the NHS is the principle is wonderful. Private medicine has something to be said for it, but it's basically socialised healthcare is incredibly important, both for social equity and I think actually for good medical practice. But it's terribly expensive. That's the problem. And we're all getting older. Medical technology is getting more and more expensive. And our governments they don't seem to admit it's difficult. They just say, it's all a question of more efficiency and better management.
Well, it's not a vote winner to say, for example, that you'd have to be taxed more or
No, I know,
whatever
that's
else
the
to
problem.
pay for it.
But
So is that your solution?
Well, I think if we want good healthcare, this country has to put more money into it. And I think there should be a public debate. There are many answers to that. You could have a hypothecated health tax. You could have to pay when you go to see a doctor, which happens in some countries. You could have some sort of insurance scheme. But you've got to educate the public that actually if they want good healthcare, they're going to have to pay more one way or another. And we spend less on healthcare in this country than any other equivalent country. It's back down to about 6 or 7% of GNP. So, historically we spend much, much less. The NHS has always been fantastic value for money compared to any other developed country. But it's now desperately under-resourced because of the ageing population and the huge cost of treating cancer and all these new cancer drugs, which cost a fortune because the pharmaceutical companies are businessmen, not altruists. But there's no sort of public discussion of this, at least not from the government side. And I find that very distressing.
Do you think that doing PPE at university, doing politics, philosophy and economics, gave you a different take on the world than someone who was in medicine from
Yes,
18?
I think it probably did. For various reasons, I've trained or partially trained many American neurosurgeons who came to work in my department over the years. And in America, medicine is a postgraduate degree. They all go to college, as they call university, first. So my American trainees would all have been, they wouldn't have actually been working as doctors until usually their late 20s. And I was always hugely impressed by them. They were, admitted they're Americans, so they worked incredibly hard. And there are many things about America I think are fantastic, one of which is the work ethic. But I think yes, I was terribly lucky to have a sort of double education, both in what I suppose you could call social science and in medical science. And
It's, just to be clear, you did that first, and then you went off
Yes.
and did a few things for a couple of years.
well, I
Were you
did
a
a whole lot-
carpenter?
No, I do
briefly?
all sorts of things.
I know you keep bees, and
My
then you came back.
bees are just swarmed, and as soon as I finish the interview, I've got to go home and catch the buggers.
Good luck with that.
That's all right.
But I mean,
I've done
it's,
it many times
it's
before.
extraordinary to have that, to get that degree and then go away for a couple of years, do something else, then come back and decide you want to do medicine and get a first.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, I'm a
yes, it is.
I'm a determined sort of person.
An overachiever.
Yes,
Professor
I'm
Marsh.
certainly an overachiever.
Henry, it's great to talk to you, and I know that you're. Well, I'm sincerely hoping that you can stay with us before going back to
No,
the
the
swarm.
bees will wait.
Will
The
they
bees
wait?
Yes,
Marvellous.
they'll wait
We'll,
again.
we'll keep hold of you for another few minutes.
All
You're
right.
listening to Henry Marsh, one of the foremost brain surgeons in the UK, retired from the NHS and still goes in occasionally, now working in the Ukraine and Nepal as well. If you've got any questions for him, there's a lovely text here. Just read it very quickly from Brian Gilder in Tamworth. Says, fascinating listen to Professor Marsh. My own daughter Poppy has been through brain surgeries at Birmingham Children's Hospitals, and the professionalism is fantastic along with the skill. Professor Sigorus, Rodriguez and Walsh have performed miracles in shaping my daughter's life. A wonderful group of human beings. Thank you from a dad who still is a dad because of these skilled and caring people.
You're listening to a BBC 5 Live podcast.
If you like this, you might also like this.
Eye of the Storm with Emma Barnett.
Every day we're covering some sort of storm that changes people's lives forever. To find out more about our range of podcasts, click, tap or swipe bbc.co.uk/5live.
Henry Marsh is our guest for the next little while. This is his second book that he's talking to us about it today. It's called Admissions. The first best-selling memoir was called Do No Harm. Henry, one of the foremost brain surgeons in the UK, now works in Nepal and Ukraine. We want to talk to you a little bit more about Ukraine, Henry, but just before we talk about that, I wondered if we could go back to how you feel now, having been treated as a patient within the NHS, about the NHS. How did it change, or did it change at all, your view of the system?
My own experiences were minimal, so and I didn't learn much from that. My wife has had a lot of time in hospital, and that she was lined up and she was in hospital for many weeks. I tell the story in the book actually. But she was awaiting major surgery and was cancelled 5 days in a row, and that's not unusual because of a lack of resources, and that's a sort of real incredibly cruel. And I'm afraid quite a lot of that happens in the NHS, and again it's a problem if you have government targets which give equal priority to routine surgery as to emergency or urgent surgery. And if it's actually taken out of the hands of the doctors as to what is clinically urgent and what isn't. And that, of course, is a consequence of being under-resourced and having to, not being able to do everything. And again, if you run with any health service, you have to have surplus capacity because emergencies come in waves. They don't all come at a steady trickle. And if you don't have surplus capacity, and there's none whatsoever in the NHS, and the bed occupancies or runs at sort of 95%, you end up with these bottlenecks. And then operations get cancelled and patients have to wait and you have waiting lists and things like that. And that's a lot of psychological suffering, as well as which, if it's really bad, patients will come to harm because of delays.
The occupied bed situation is often blamed on the lack or the cuts to social care and the lack of social care packages, particularly for elderly people to move out and into those packages in the community.
Yeah.
Do you think that social care and primary health care should be integrated or not?
Well, I'm not an expert in this field, but it's all a complex chain. And if one chain is no point making one link stronger if you don't make the other link stronger. You have to approach it in a very holistic way, where the government's tenders or stagger from one tabloid headline to another, rather than having, I think, a joined-up policy for all of it. But again, it all comes down to money, and as you said, politicians, very understandably, don't want to say we're going to put up taxes, because then they won't get elected.
Professor Marsh, Richard has just texted in to say, will you ask Professor Marsh if he still rides his bicycle to work?
I ride my bicycle every day, and I know it's caused me a lot of complaints, but I don't wear a helmet.
You are a neurosurgeon who does not wear a helmet while on a bicycle. And your explanation for that is?
Well, it's multiple. First of all, if you cycle very slowly and carefully, as I do, I think the risk is small.
Can I just point out, my father always says to me, it's not you. You can be as safe as you like. It's everybody else.
No, it's the drivers. It's other bicyclists, I find now. I've been cycling in London every day for 44 years. I've only been knocked off once, and that was 43 years ago.
Quite good going.
But there's some risk, but I accept that, and that's my choice. I'm hypocritical, I'm inconsistent to the extent I prefer my children, who all cycle, to wear helmets. But then there are more sort of jokey reasons, like saying if I get knocked off at my age and have a severe head injury, I don't want to live. And that's not an entirely stupid thought. We keep an awful lot of people alive with severe brain damage who probably would prefer not to be like that if they had no choice. It's quite difficult. If you looked at it as a question of public health policy, there was in fact a leader in the BMJ 2 years ago about this, because bicycle helmets are compulsory in Canada, Australia and New Zealand. They did a study in Canada looking at emergency admissions with cycle injuries, head injuries. There was no change in between introducing and before the legislation was introduced. So the evidence is not clear. It's certainly not as clear as it was in motorbikes. If, on the other hand, if you cycle, as many people do in London, these urban warriors, head hunched over the handlebars, very fast, weaving between the traffic, video camera on their head, then I think it makes sense to wear a helmet. But I don't think it makes sense to cycle like that anyway in London.
Interesting, just mentioning there about cycling and your attitude towards mortality, or indeed what happens to you if you were to crash off your bike quite seriously. Now, you describe your suicide kit in the book. Why do you have such a thing, knowing, of course, that such a thing is illegal? It's not illegal to kill oneself. It's a joke at the beginning. I say I like to joke that my most precious possession is my suicide kit, but it's a very serious joke because in this country, more than half of us will die in hospital, often in a pretty distressing, unpleasant way. Only a minority of people make it to hospices, and even then there are many, many different ways of dying, and I'm not going to sort of go over them in horrible detail. Dying can be very peaceful, it can be very easy, it can be very, very difficult. Death is the same for everybody, but dying isn't. Now, there are quite a few countries like Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, an increasing number of the states in America, where I don't like the word euthanasia, it's all assisted dying, is legal. It seems to work very well. There's no evidence that it's being abused in any way. So we actually have evidence that when it is legal, it doesn't seem to cause terrible problems. And opinion surveys in this country, time and time again, have shown the public is broadly in support of this. But for reasons I don't really understand, Parliament isn't, and has rejected a bill for it once again.
They say it's open to abuse, don't they? And they also say that people would feel so guilty, ultimately, older people.
Well, there's no evidence from other countries, unless you have a very pessimistic view of English people, which may be fully justified, as opposed to other human beings. There's no evidence to justify that.
So what would be the circumstances in which you would feel that you have to take matters into your own hands?
Well, it's very difficult, and we never know how we'll react until it actually happens. But if I knew I had motor neurone disease, where essentially you will die by choking to death, I would not want that to happen. And also motor neurone disease is a death sentence, although how long it takes is variable. And there are some other cancers which can be very unpleasant. What assisted dying will not solve is the huge problem of dementia, because the whole idea of assisted dying...
Which your father had.
Yes. It's not, and many people have it, assisted dying is not licensing doctors to kill patients, is giving freedom of choice to probably the small number of people who don't want to draw their dying moments out. And that's a profoundly important point. It's about freedom of choice.
Does that mean you would travel abroad?
I don't know, because the honest answer, it would depend on the illness I had. And I hope I would. I hope I'd be brave enough to do that. Or to find some other way of killing myself. But I'm not saying I would do that, because I genuinely don't know. But it's not as a doctor, having seen what dying can be like, and I know many doctors feel the same way as I do, one has no illusions about it. And it's very difficult. We're all frightened of death. It's something very hard to think about. And then what my second book is, in a sense, addressing time in a recurrent sort of way, is this hugely difficult problem. We have this deep fear of death, which is, in a sense, irrational, because if you don't believe in an afterlife, when you're dead, you're dead. But dying is a very different kettle of fish. And as I said, there are many different ways of dying, but I don't like talking about it. People don't like thinking about it. Just as I said earlier, talking to these parents in Ukraine. Was it to you or somebody else? Anyway,
No, it was.
It was. It's incredibly painful and very difficult. We all shy away from it. But the fact of the matter is, we condemn many of ourselves to a pretty miserable end because we find it so difficult to look death in the face.
What part do you think faith plays?
I don't know.
Are you a man of faith?
No, not at all. I mean, to me, it does seem highly unlikely there's an afterlife.
Being in Nepal would be interesting then, where of course
well, it's deep.
Buddhism,
I know it's very difficult.
which believes in an afterlife.
The families there, but the odd thing is, the families there find it incredibly difficult to accept that their loved one is going to die, and it's
even with the knowledge of reincarnation, which
I know,
is of course
exactly.
at the heart of Buddhism.
Yeah. Well, it's all about psychological paradoxes. It's very working in different cultures. You get very, very different reactions to how you discuss these things.
You said you fell in love with Nepal
Yes.
just exactly in the way that you would fall in love with a woman, which I
Yes.
believe was, not wishing to be personal, but is it 7 times or
Yeah,
9?
7 times. I'm a rather romantic sort of person, but it was usually unrequited. Don't get me wrong.
But you've managed to tot up 7 times being in love in your life, which
Yes,
is
or
it's
having
wonderful.
sort of crushes.
One per decade at least. That's pretty
well, it's
good going.
It's a wonderful feeling, isn't it?
Yes,
being in
it
love?
is.
It doesn't last. And there's quite a lot of science on it now. It lasts
Yeah,
about
I'm
6
afraid
months.
so. I'm afraid so. But Ukraine, why did you keep going back and are still going back to the
Well,
Ukraine?
that's a long story.
We have a little bit of time.
Well, I first went in 1992, more or less by chance. I was shocked by the conditions I found. When I was studying politics and economics at Oxford, I'd done a special paper in the Soviet studies. I didn't speak Russian, but partly because my mother came from what was to become East Germany and was a refugee from Nazi Germany. I'd always been terribly interested in totalitarianism, and I never thought I'd combine. So I suppose if I hadn't gone into medicine, maybe I'd have become what was called in those days a Kremlinologist. But then I sort of strayed into brain surgery in the way one does. And I never thought I'd combine Kremlinology with brain surgery, but I did. And it was because I met this very, very dynamic, charismatic, slightly crazy, fanatical young doctor. And it was easy to help him in the early years, particularly with spinal surgery, because neurosurgery is both brain and spinal surgery, by taking him out second-hand equipment and showing him how to do things in a more modern way. But as the years went by, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, Ukraine changed in many ways for the better, although, of course, they have a war now with Russia, sort of frozen, semi-frozen war. And my colleague, I'm afraid, it became rather like George Orwell's Animal Farm, that he started to suffer from the problems I thought were the bad characteristics I thought he'd been rebelling against when I first met him. So, in fact, I've stopped working with him now, and I tell this story fairly politely in my new book. It's a very sad story in many ways, but now I'm working with a different set of doctors who are much younger, and I get on very well with. So in fact, I spent the last 2 weeks in Ukraine, in the beautiful city of Lviv in the west of the country. And I had a wonderful time, partly because the operations went well, which is always ultimately, it was something I was trying to convey in my first book. But as a neurosurgeon, when you go to work in the morning, you really don't know whether you're going to come home feeling reasonably happy or deeply depressed. It's a very bipolar trade.
Henry, thank you so much for talking to us today.
It's a pleasure.
How many bees do you have to capture?
Well, I don't know. They've already swarmed twice, which is rather annoying because it means the main hive is slightly reduced in numbers. But there's usually about sort of 7,000 or 8,000 bees in the swarm, something like that.
Good luck with that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for talking to us. That is
All right.
Henry
It was a
Marsh.
pleasure.
The new book
Bye-bye.
is called Admissions, and the previous one, very, very well worth reading, is called Do No Harm.